Hi, everyone. I hope you got your coffee or your tea. We are here in our 13th installment of What is Truth. I'm here with Right Reverend David William Parry, author of Mount Athos Inside Me, that can be found on Amazon. And I'm the author of the Arcana of the Grail Angel and Arcana of Light on the Path. They can be found on eBay here in the States. If you're outside the country, just contact me directly through Facebook, what have you. And we can work something out. Anyways, David, how are you?
Well, very fine, my friend. Always good speaking with you. We've got TEDx Lambeth coming up next Friday, and I've done so little preparation. It's untrue, so that's worrying me to death. Apart from that, yeah, lies, deceit, and lockdown. I'm managing to survive so far. We'll see what happens. How about yourself?
I'm doing fine. How's it going with your new entrance into the Royal Society? I always thought you were a closet royalist.
You broke up a bit.
What?
You broke up a bit with my new.
Your
you broke up a bit.
Your induction into the Royal Society.
New. Oh, well, I mean,
I always thought you were a closet
really fun. Royalist. I mean, I've noticed a couple of snipey remarks, like how do I become a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society? And I'll tell everybody, 8 years of hard work.
You got a bad signal today.
Extensive travelling in Central Asia. About it. So if you're willing to do that, then I'm sure they'll do business with you as well. Yeah, I mean, I've just found my academic, if that's the word I'm looking for. I'm sort of so cynical about that word these days. My academic sort of scholarly home. They're an incredible group. I mean, it's an actual real Royal Society where you get actual things called scholars, that disappearing breed from our terrains nowadays. And of course, I mean, we're all looking at absolutely fascinating parts of the world. I discern most of them actually mean India. They're aiming at India, or they're aiming at Southern Asia. So you're looking at sort of, those exotic jungled climes that the British used to go to and do nefarious things like make business with soldiers, fully armed soldiers at their back. But in my case, it's the gentle Central Asia that I've always loved. I've noticed, for sad political reasons, I've started doing a little work with the Azerbaijanis again. Sadly, I mean, it's an ongoing situation. They've been having trouble with the Armenians over a disputed area called Nagorno-Karabakh for a number of years. The United Nations has found in their favor, but reality is reality. So these lands that legally belong to Azerbaijan certainly are occupied by Armenian forces, and shelling started not too long ago. And I suppose this may seem strange coming from me. That's the realities. Those are the realities of life in this dispensation. Sadly, I wish they weren't, but there's such a thing as original sin, and so on. So there was a ceasefire over the last day or so, which made me very relieved. But I noticed this morning shelling had started again. What I don't like about modern warfare is the fact civilians are targets. And certainly the city of Ganja, which I've been to in Azerbaijan, a beautiful, tranquil, preserved city. I mean, that got shelled during the night. And a lot of sadness is happening at the minute. So my work with the Caucasus is reviving a little. But, my passion has always been Central Asia. And I look forward to intriguing the Royal Asiatic Society with a number of harebrained schemes over the next year or so, which I hope they will pay for. If you're listening, that's my opening shot. So, so apart from that, yeah, fine, John.
I'd be interested to find out the connection between the East India Company and the Royal Asiatic Society. Probably the Royal Asiatic Society focuses on outposts of the East India Company, one of which is an interesting place was Singapore.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the sort of Southern Asia bit I don't really look at myself. I have very little time and patience for the East India Company. Some friends of mine in Tamil Nadu a couple of years ago told me one of their local sayings was "never trust the East India Company," which which sort of didn't surprise me but deeply depressed me. And apparently there are similar sayings across the region.
Do they know that you're a relative of directors of the East India Company?
Yeah, I think they're fully aware that that doesn't actually mean much in my case. I'm a threadbare pastor trying to hold body and soul together. Yeah, you know, families are families. I don't know much about that side of the family. I'd like to know more. I'd like to know more, curiously. But yeah, you know, my free church morals are largely free church morals. I don't go for all this nastiness, and the world will be a better place when we've outgrown it all. That's my view, and I'll stick to it. So there we are.
Well, I think that's a healthy way to take it in. In previous episodes, I've made mention of a lecture cycle that Rudolf Steiner gave called, it was during World War I, called The Fall of the Spirits of Darkness. And in there, he gives a very detailed analysis of the war in heaven that happened from the 1840s and culminated in the fall of 1879, to where the forces of light, through Michael, the archangel, drove the opposition, the opposing spirits down, which is essentially the image of St. George and the dragon. That's like St. George is like a Michaelic figure, and he's holding back the dragon of Ahriman, or materialism, the satanic, limited to physicality, utilitarian view, that Marxist view, that whole a human being's a walking piece of meat perspective, and thoughts are just like result of chemical interactions in the brain of some sort, and there's no acknowledgement of the spiritual being of man. And you know, somebody might look askance at me saying that there's this war in heaven, but yet Rudolf Steiner makes it very clear that it was an actual event, and but could only be appreciated by people who are very cognizant of the fact of that one of the most frequent subjects in both the Old and the New Testament is the intervention of angelic beings into human evolution. And it's been kind of the storyline of materialism that all events in history originate from humans, and that we just we've crafted all of our history, and there's no acknowledgement on their part of that inspiration that comes from the spiritual world, specifically during a human life, from the angels, archangels, and archai, or time spirits, and life between death and a new birth, the other hierarchies beyond that, your exousiae, dunamis, kuriotes, thrones, cherubim and seraphim, of the Dionysius stream of Dionysius the Areopagite, the first bishop of Athens, who was initiated into Christianity by St. Paul. It's a very important, because if you look at St. Paul as a figure, he's really like the meeting of the Hebraic stream and that Greek philosophic stream. You know, at the time, the language in that region in the Middle East was Koine Greek, and he was a very well schooled in the traditions of Greece and of Hebraic, and was running around chasing down Christians, punishing them for being Christians, until he went to Damascus and had his experience to where he was confronted by the resurrected Jesus Christ. And the doctrine that came from him is ultimately that way in which the development between this Greek and Hebraic stream melded together. And it's been a source of conflict, by the way, because there's so many denominations of Christianity. Like I said, according to government figures, there's more than 35,000 denominations in the United States. And they didn't include me because I'm my own denomination. So that's 35,001. But in any event, we're just trying to make the point that the depth of the Bible is unparalleled, and that that's demonstrated by it being appreciated from anybody from a simple farmer all the way up to somebody who's engaged in something as heady as nuclear physics. And so as a result of this, there's these parallel lines of development: intellectual history, human intellectual history, and then the spiritual backdrop of that history. And so when you get to understand that leading up to the age of Michael, this period following after the war in heaven that culminated in the fall of 1879, was the age of Gabriel. And Gabriel is the archangel of the Annunciation, right? He's shown with a lily, and it has a connection to the lunar mysteries, which is the blood mysteries, which is so evident in the Old Testament. Everybody's, so and so begat so and so, and that was the wholesome development of culture at that time. And the adversarial spirits would contend with that. They were the rebels. They were the Prometheans, were the Luciferic spirits, so you have these Lucifer and Ahriman coming into ascendancy during different periods of history as who's more influential. As we approach the time of the incarnation of Christ, it became a time in which the ancient mysteries had fallen into a decadent state, and there was, all kinds of nefarious things going on in an effort to maintain a connection with the tutelary spirits of the various mysteries. Because as you go back earlier in time, the more further back you go, the more clairvoyant, until you get to the Atlantean period, and people's dream state was more real than their life in the physicality. And so consequently, I finally said it. And so consequently, as we move towards this Great War in Heaven in 1879 culmination, you see that within England specifically, a very important thing having to do with those mysteries of blood, and that were wholesome mysteries leading up to that time in the main, that were supported by the forces of light. Now the forces of ancestry, blood, tribal, and even nation are counter images of the wishes of the forces of light. Because when the forces of darkness and error were pushed to earth, these Promethean, Luciferic forces and the satanic Ahrimanic materialism. They came to Earth and to pursue their development by inhabiting the minds of human beings. And so you have some pretty remarkable individuals that represent that transition. And of course, it's a gradual thing, so you mustn't see it as if it wasn't after 1879, it doesn't count. And so, in light of that I've been, reinforming myself with that lecture cycle recently, and so it just figures that being as synchronistic as my life is, that what movie did we watch the other day but Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? And that's, I think, and I thought, I got to talk about that with David. So anyways, first of all, I want to know, David, have you read that book?
Let me just say one more glowing thing about the Royal Asiatic Society. Their publications are incredible, and their terms and conditions for renting rooms for lectures, I intend to avail myself of next year with this bloody Nephilim conference that never seems to go ahead. Yes, I've read, because that sort of fits with Mary Shelley. What a great treasure of literature. A young girl distantly related to Wollstonecraft, arguably one of the first modern feminists. The partner of William Godwin, of course, the great political anarchist, the father of that type of political philosophy. Good-hearted people. I mean, those words have got a lot of baggage in the recent century or so, but the history is golden for both of those words. And I remember the first time I read Frankenstein, and realizing that Victor wasn't a bad boy at all. What is wrong with a sense of curiosity? And of course, the sad thing is the monster wasn't all bad either. When they've sort of had it out amidst the ice and the snow, and the monster's last phrase is, "I'm done with man," you think, well, after the way you've been treated, I'm not really surprised. No, I mean, an age of inquiry and conquest reflected in that young girl's mind. I mean, how on earth did she come up with the thought of a new Prometheus, which of course is the subtitle of that book, and the radical idea of mixing the sciences with the occult arts, of course, which is how Victor manages to achieve his goals. I mean, I remember one scene in the book early on, I think it's in the carriage of his father, where Victor is showing Baron Frankenstein, who was also a research scholar, as well as being the local big knob, what he was reading, and having the book completely despised by his father, sort of as medieval mildew. And it was Victor that very clearly says, if he'd have given any other reaction, then I might have actually left those books alone. But the fact was so made me interested, made me intrigued. And I think we've got to remember that there's immense knowledge of a different type in those books, which the young Mary Shelley very clearly alludes to. I mean, a remarkable achievement, but that opens up vistas for other types of, mysteries of British literature, English literature. How did the Brontes know about the depths of and perversity when they were all vicars' daughters living on their top nowhere? I mean, how could anyone come up with Heathcliff when she's never actually gone out with a man before? Wuthering Heights is an extreme, and it opens with, of course, hauntings and ghosts and what have you, and it's very, very clear that they're both going to hell. I mean, if the book is read properly, but I mean, the smile that I think it's on Heathcliff's face.
You're breaking,
just dying.
breaking up there.
They're unpleasant.
starting from
it's where everybody's at home because but Boris Johnson is trying to frighten us all to death. So everybody's at home at John. Sheeple, which I'm forced to live in at the minute. They're all terrified in case they catch a light cough. I know there's more to coronavirus than a light cough, but it doesn't excuse everything we're told. Yes, sir. No, sir, my lord. All that has to stop. Anyway,
I've been having trouble getting.
So
I've been.
Am I on air, John? Am I still there?
You're breaking up, and
I mean,
I've had difficulty with communicating with people over the pond. I did a show with Zishan the other day, and it kept breaking up. And now here you are in London, but it tends to subside after a little bit. You were saying relative to Mary Shelley, I think that's the kind of the path I wanted to kind of peek into, because it's a fascinating prequel to a statement that Rudolf Steiner had made. He said that the first book penned by Ahriman in the modern era is Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which was a children's book that was serialized starting in 1881 and then published as a book later on. And you see in that, and it's kind of peculiar because you'd think that Ahriman's first endeavor would be like some kind of philosophical materialistic treatise that George Soros would like, but it's far more insidious in the way in which it encroaches, and you see a prequel to that in Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein: A Modern Prometheus, and she was the Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and her father was a leading utilitarian. Now, we've talked about utilitarianism before on here, where we were talking about John Stuart Mill and our friend pickled in the lobby of University College. But Rudolf Steiner specifically made reference to utilitarianism and Bolshevism as being the forces that were driven to earth, that Ahrimanic element, and consequently, although it meets its most refined form in the works of John Stuart Mill. I mean, it's almost like approaching human culture as some kind of mathematical formula. Well, you do it because it's good for business, basically, and that was his stance, the ultimate end game of his book on liberty, which became really a kind of one of the leading proclamations, along with Thomas Paine. And but when you look at that, and Rudolf Steiner says, but you always have to look for the source of the inspiration. You can't just grab a conceptual relationship, an abstract relationship to these things. You have to say, is the source of inspiration wholesome or is it unwholesome? And because there are forces that in a certain period of time can be of a wholesome influence on mankind, and then as there's a transformation of our relationship to the spiritual world, these forces that at one time were wholesome, forces promoting bloodlines and tribes and royalty and all that kind of stuff, the nobility and the divine right of kings. At one time, that was an appropriate upbuilding thing for human culture, but those are ideas that in 1879 had reached their culmination at the end of the age of Archangel Gabriel and entering into the Michaelic age in which we're currently in. And but in looking at Mary Shelley, and you look at her father, he's like William Godwin was he was basically the first anarchist of the modern era. He is, when you see that A with that long line through it, that goes back to William Godwin, Mary Shelley's father, and he owned a bookstore, and so she just went through her childhood in the sea of books. And people don't know this, but even at one time, the Godwin family had a relationship to Thomas Taylor, and people go, "Well, who's that?" Well, he's the guy who translated the complete editions of Plato and Aristotle, plus the Neoplatonic authors, Plotinus, Proclus, and many of the lesser Neoplatonic authors. And he wrote a book on mathematics, and he was a brilliant man who was an inspiration. Emerson considered him one of his, if not his chief inspiration in a lot of the work that he did. He'd become acquainted with the works of Thomas Taylor through his relationship to Bronson Alcott, who's Louisa May Alcott's father. And so there's a whole underpinning of the way in which literary culture relates to development, and how much of it is trying to pull us along the way they have it today. Like most of the stuff you see on TV is they have an agenda. They're trying to get you to think along certain lines, and that's a characteristic that's embedded in literature and poetry and plays throughout history. They've been very formative, but nonetheless, to be able to try and have self-reference in the face of these things, and be your own man, be your own woman, be your own individual, and so that you see these seething struggles that Mary Shelley's mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who is she's like the original feminist. I mean, her on the rights of women was a seminal work as the works of Thomas Paine. But then you go at Thomas Taylor, who was the landlord of the family at one time. He writes a response to On the Rights of Women, to where he takes it like almost mathematically and calculates to its end game on the rights of brutes. He says, well, by what you're saying, that means therefore, but it's a ludubrium. It's a humorous book, although it'd be difficult for the modern individual to appreciate a lot of the humor. But I had an edition of that, like I first ran across that about 40 years ago. And so it was interesting to see this movie going, oh yeah, it reminded me all this stuff. And I realized that it actually dovetails into the conversations that we've been having. I hope your sound is back.
I've got to get more. Yeah, I've got to get more skill with that mute button. I'm raising my Sherlock Holmes spyglass, and I've got the tip for, of course, to go with it, because there's something happening on the screen I can't work out. Some weird little light going on, so it's making me completely paranoid. Oh, where do I begin with all that?
That's where they're.
I think there's something very. Oh my God, no, don't. Remember when I did the work with the People's Voice? It was basically the old BBC down there trying to do a good work, and David Icke. So you hear a lot about conspiracies in that neck of the woods. Oh, and I don't want to get into that one because that opens mares' nests. I think there's something very wholesome in a discussion between books. I don't think there should be neutral books. Books are arguments, they're statements, they're views of life, they're views of reality. You know, I mean, if we look at the ultimate book nowadays written by sort of a young feminist, you know, a man was interested in a woman, she told him to respect her rights, and he agreed. The end. I rather like a discussion between authors and books there's something very. I don't like the idea of neutral books at all. I mean, what on earth would they say? Why would there be a need to print them? Unfortunately, my view of modern publishing is they're all neutral books now, so they're not saying anything, and no books are youth reading in Central Asia as well. A dear friend of mine is Mukhtar Shakhanov, the Nobel Prize-winning poet of recent history in Kazakhstan. He's a good friend of mine. And he said to me one of the last times I was out in Almaty, well, what's going on over there then? We can't get the youth of Kazakhstan to read anything. And I said, but it's exactly here. And why aren't they reading anything? And why aren't they buying books? Because there's nothing to read and there's nothing to buy. PC at its worst, censorship at its most flagrant, and there's nothing worth reading. So I'm not sure I want neutral books. There's absolutely nothing wrong in trying to convince somebody that your view has my view, their view has body and weight. And the trouble, I suppose, is the educational system that never allows people to be educated in a correct way, never allows critical thinking to properly develop, and never gives anyone the resources they need to form their own opinion. I think it's much better to worry about education and the way people approach reading, which is an art and skill in itself. I don't really want, as I say, neutrality. If anything, I think until very recently that was a genuine discussion between authors. Now it seems more like social engineering. And I don't know, in my weird British perspective, that sort of starts somewhere in the mid-80s, I think, when you get things arising that are clearly designed to show anyone that disagrees with a certain position as somehow a bad citizen or somehow a bad person. I mean, that's new, I think. If we're thinking of Mary Wollstonecraft, I mean, her criticisms, her critique of the French philosopher Rousseau, I mean, they're body blows. She's absolutely correct. If there was a great genius of that particular period in France, it's Rousseau. The whiny, whingy Jean-Jacques. I mean, even when he came to Britain, he's accusing people of trying to poison him. I mean, wasn't it David Hughes? He said, that man is trying to poison me, which I personally interpret as a comment on British cooking. But I mean, and then he's off back to Europe again because he can't stand anymore. So what Wollstonecraft is entitled to her opinion and says a few really interesting things. But if I compare that, say, to what was that American soap opera years back, Dallas, where you were absolutely nobody unless you were rich, unless you dressed like $1 million and you had local influence, you were nobody. And the worst example of it was, Bored Housewives. I can't remember, Desperate Housewives, where basically one of the central characters, Bree, says cynically at one point, you can always trust the poor when she wants someone to steal something for her own nefarious reasons. I mean, this is something very, very different. It's not a discussion. It's a sort of indoctrinational thing. And also, right, lastly, before I hand the com back, I mean, we've got to be careful to make sure we understand the full depth and brevity of what people were doing in the past. I mean, I can't remember. I was talking about this recently. It might have been on this show. I'm not sure. And we have to remember that the origin of species was actually how Darwin was a Unitarian. Why didn't he go to Anglican church with his wife? He was a Unitarian. Free church people in this country know his background and the religious background of his family. And if that book was actually held up in a couple of Unitarian pulpits as a great insight to understanding nature, we've got to be careful, I think, to a certain extent. Now, absolutely everything is politicized. Where did that come from? I mean, in Britain at the moment, it's like living in North Korea, where you can't move outside the house without it being a political gesture. And not wearing a face mask somehow means you're a radical terrorist wanting to bomb Buckingham Palace. I mean, but all of this is new. we need to recover a sense of proportion and propriety, I suspect. And, try and remember that books were discussions, and they were important discussions. I mean, I never really understood the argument between Darwin and Huxley about evolution, because really you could see that as some sort of deism, in which case, I mean, he says at the end of The Origin of Species, the two things he eats, peacocks. So, it's not church and free thinking. All of a sudden it makes sense. Yeah, the Darwins used to hold literary soirees at their pad, where you've got sort of neo-druids turning up, and they read from the Upanishads to look at the mysteries of India. So we've got to be careful. I think that's enriching, John. But I worry about what's passing and what's being funded for the arts nowadays, where basically, if it's not some sort of social collaboration or social containment, there's something wrong. I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, if it doesn't fit the agenda, it doesn't get the financing, and that's the bugaboo of the world of scholarship, right? I mean, if you hold an unpopular view, okay, fine, but you just won't get any funding, or you'll get knocked out of the department. Yeah, it's that natural tendency that can, as we call them here in America, control freaks. But getting back to looking at that, yeah, you have to allow people the opportunity to investigate all the various modalities that can arise. And going back to Rudolf Steiner in his personal biography, related to Darwin is Haeckel, the German scientific philosopher, and Rudolf Steiner, because of his interest in trying to he would always totally enter into somebody's thought to see what their mindset was regarding things, and he would end up being accused of being one of them. When he do that, like through his study of Haeckel and Hegel and Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. We talked about that before. I mean, he was offered the editorship of Nietzsche's work by Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, and but so Rudolf Steiner wrote a book, Nietzsche, the Fight for Freedom, and his response to having the opportunity to edit Nietzsche's work was that he said he would do it under one condition, that he could make margin notes regarding which things Nietzsche wrote when he was healthy and things he wrote when he was ill, suffering from the degeneracy of syphilis, apparently. And so Steiner was the most open, is to be able to try and get behind somebody's thought and understand what they thought, and if you do that in a modern context, you get accused of being one of them. Oh, you're one of them, and everything has gone into this whole kind of bipolar. It's crazy because, you see, ultimately that's materialism. Materialism ultimately devolves into conflict. Why? Because you can't solve the issues in life using the concepts of mechanics. It just doesn't work, because it's going back to what we talked about with the set theory of your friend Bertrand Russell and that whole cast of mind, is that there's this set, but see, the universe is an open set, so you can't assume that all of the parts of the equation, and that's the rub. See, and when you get any reductionist view, it wants to simplify things. that's the single theory that is the backdrop of monism in general, and it's incapable of providing a sufficient number of answers for phenomenology. And so the beauty of that, and Rudolf Steiner said, getting to education, because you were talking about that, he said that when young people are educated, they have to be given images, riddles, cloaked in images, and that gives them something to ponder. And so that as they get into later in life, it becomes a healthy development for them as they mature and come to understand these things more and more. Not this like reductionist, okay, here's the answer to this, here's the answer to that, period. And it's a completely different pedagogical view because it's developmental. And so you have like the green snake and the beautiful lily of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe being something that Rudolf Steiner said was very, very significant and is in a way a different Goethe's version of the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. It's a story of initiation, and you can ponder that, and it provides you with imaginal images to connect you to the spiritual world. It could serve as a vehicle for your relationship to the world of concepts and thinking. And translated into English by Thomas Carlyle. And so when you get into the Romantics, it's very interesting because you have to keep in mind that Percy Bysshe Shelley considered himself an atheist, right? And then you have Goethe in Germany championing the poetry of Lord Byron. And Lord Byron was a complete Lothario. I mean, that guy was one of the worst womanizers in history. In fact, his daughter, his only daughter in his actual marriage, she ended up becoming the inventor of what would evolve into computer language, right? She created machine language. And so there's this whole, you see the inner, the outer, the harmonic, luciferic, seething puzzle that can only be solved through coming to the Christ impulse of balance, to hold the forces of spacey mysticism of Lucifer all the way to ardent materialism of Ahriman, and to be able to bring these as a means to interpret, so that, for example, if I read a work of somebody who's a materialist, it's as if my universe is granulating and it's becoming atomistic. And if I read like the Gospel of John or something of Novalis, it's as if you're walking through a meadow of flowers. So I guess you could take your pick.
Gosh, I know what you mean about reading materialists. I mean, I do. I suppose as ministers of the gospel go, I'm quite unusual because I do read them. And of course, my great reading, I suppose you could say I cut my teeth, which is I've got no teeth left. I cut my teeth on the existentialists, which was very, very hard going at first until I realized what it was they were trying to do and where they were trying to get to. And, of course, their great unhappiness actually was with modernity. They're actually mostly against modernity. If you think about how it all fits together, and they're certainly against the type of reductive materialism that leads to human beings as bags of chemistry. I mean, what they're trying to do in their own terms, mostly, not all of them, but mostly is think about what does the inner life of a human being actually mean? And is it fully formed or not? And where is it going? I mean, Jean-Paul Sartre, and before anybody jumps on me, yes, you normally say Sartre, but in Paris, you say Sartre. So, ha! Right? So, Jean-Paul Sartre, what was it? Being before essence, which of course was an attack on Hegel. Hegel, of course, being the most the most intelligent Lutheran that's ever lived, having Sunday lunch with the local pastor. I love that one. Hegel, mind blowing. Anyway, so I mean, I don't have a soft spot for French existentialists. I mean, I got to read at great depth a Russian existentialist, Berdyaev, who apparently, to my horror, I discovered recently was being championed and read by Putin of all people. Oh my God, has the man actually understood the book? But anyway, to the side. Which of course is really the religious search, and it's done in a very modern way, because he's saying, okay, human beings have a unique existence. We cannot be treated like other objects in space. Maybe everything else can be. Everything is an object in space with relationships to other objects in space, physical objects. But he would have said, but that's completely inappropriate for a human being, because we can suffer, we can love, we can be angry, we can hope. Can those objects do that? And then we get to sort of weird hinterlands, like do dolphins do it, or the higher apes? But okay, then they're more human than people think they are. Certainly, when I was reading Berdyaev, I couldn't help thinking of Swedenborg all the time. Swedenborg's big thing is that we're assailed every day, every minute of every day, by messages from the infernal worlds and messages from the angelic worlds. I think that's very close to what you're saying and what Steiner is saying. And it's the job of each and every human being to work that out as they grow older in life, and then find the focus, impulse energy. It reminds me of something in the Gospels. If thine eye be single, if your eye is single, your body. Is that a way of talking about the third eye? Well, probably yes. But it's as a call to try and look beyond these opposing forces at the impulse in our lives and our surroundings, energy, Christ conscious, which of course, ironically, leads to a false. We're united together, we're one in the Christ consciousness, but we're also united in the Christ consciousness. Clarity. So, I would say, in part answer to what you said, which as usual is intriguing, people should grapple with the type of material that makes them uncomfortable. I remain incredibly grateful to the Camus of the world, the Sartres of the world, the Unamunos of the world. I mean, when I first read, I can't remember offhand the name of his short story about a Roman Catholic priest that's losing his faith, I felt uncomfortable on every single page of that book. But when I got to, and one of the great lines, if I hadn't read the book, I wouldn't have come up with this great line. The priest who's losing his faith says to one of his congregants, "Oh, don't worry about the truth. That's what Protestants worry about." Which, so sorry to everyone who's Roman Catholic, and it's just a line from a book. Don't worry. But yeah, it was just one of those little lines that stuck in my head ever since then. And no, we got to grapple more with the antinomies. Thinking of TEDx Lambeth next Friday, with the creative opposites, with the things that make us uncomfortable. I don't understand the modern generation, said the old dinosaur. They want everything easy and everything solved and everything given to them on a golden platter. That's not the life of a quest. That's not the life of a knight or a hero. That's not the life of a warrior. That's not the life of a shaman. That is the life of an object in space, a mere physical thing, as opposed to somebody humanizing and becoming one with the cosmos, because you certainly can't do that as a mere object in space. So curiously, I think Swedenborg and Steiner are talking about the absolute same thing in different ways. And without the existentialists, I probably wouldn't have realized that. I'm handing back.
Yeah, you shouldn't be shy in wrestling in the world of ideas. And you mentioned dolphins, right? Yeah, you mentioned. I had a brief contact with the wife of John Lilly, the scientist who did all the work on communicating with dolphins. He was considered a walking syllabus of Western science. He's the guy who worked with the sensory deprivation tanks, where you go in there and float in absolute silence and darkness as like a meditative tool, and really dramatic results for people doing that. And we were investigating the possibility of starting a deprivation tank center here in Detroit. And so I talked to his wife on the phone about it. And but yeah, there is that, and it's the challenge, because scientism is taking science and using it as a political apparatus, so to speak, or a way of getting in charge of the narrative. Whereas science is open-ended, because you assume, the scientific method assumes, you don't necessarily have all the information, and so you have to have a certain openness. Although that frequently falls apart. I mean, at the turn of the century, the guy who ran the patent office said, well, we could close the patent office, everything's already been invented. But and I had made mention before, though, that most of the inventions of the industrial age in England were dissenting ministers. So it was that they disagreed with the establishment view, that they were thinking outside the box, and so, which is a healthy thing. Now that we've gotten past the 1879, where integrity of the group was vitally important for developmental reasons of human culture, now it's Ritter made the point, it's like, that it's good to teach the children the alphabet, but you don't keep teaching them the alphabet when they're 30, 40 years old. I mean, it's not the same thing. And so you see that things change in time, is the point he was trying to make. And I was just paraphrasing. I wasn't specifically quoting, but he does use that example of teaching the alphabet. And that becomes the challenge, because you think that when you're young, you think you've got it all figured out, right? And what Winston Churchill said, he said, anybody who isn't a liberal when they're young doesn't have a heart. Anybody who isn't conservative when they're old doesn't have a brain. and so there's this balancing act between the issues and what one might be willing to do to achieve those initiatives, and this whole reductionist thought of the end justifies the means, to use the Jesuit saying, is ultimately, if you take utilitarian to the max, then it becomes up with being, through the machine language of Byron's daughter, it ends up becoming, well, the most expedient thing is that people are a problem. We got to get rid of some people. And that's the kind of thinking that unfortunately people within the technocratic super state, they tend to think like that, because they are materialists. And that's the problem. And that's why they hate Christianity. They want to obliterate it. They want to remove it from the earth. And of course, there's two different agendas being served. The unredeemed Luciferic spirits want to turn this into a world of ghosts that are not physical. And Ahriman wants to reduce everything down to a supercomputer of some sort, some kind of mechanical entity. And we're in the middle. We have to be able to deal with the Talmud of this, and you can't deal with the Talmud if you're not aware of it. And So what you're saying is so true. You have to be able to entertain thoughts that disagree with you, that you find disagreeable. You have to be able to enter into them and say, why would somebody think that? Even if it's something as difficult as Martin Heidegger, who's probably somebody you've read, and I could probably count on one hand of the people I've run into in the last 20 years that have read Martin Heidegger. But so that's a real battle to be able to come to terms with that. But so much of it, you could see that like Rita Steiner, when talking about the Gnostics, makes the point of that, scholars would look upon as that they're crazy. And he says, but you have to, Rita Steiner says, you have to understand that the Gnosticism is an outgrowth of the Greek culture that was cultivated through Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonics, Proclus, all of that. And that it's a giving forth when you get into talking about the 30 aeons and all these systems. He says it's pointing towards something, but they didn't have the sufficient concepts to be able to frame it the way we can today. See, and so we can carry the subject matter, shall we say, carry it further into the realms of comprehension. If they've read who? Oh, you broke up. I broke up. Oh, I'm breaking up. Okay. If they read, well, I'm not sure which point you're referring to, but anyways, it's okay because it becomes a riddle. Okay, who am I talking about? Oh, Martin Heidegger, I think she might be referring to. But that's not really central to our conversation. That's just an aside when you start getting into the whole idea of existential philosophy and the challenges of trying to figure out phenomenology relating to numenology. There, I'll give you a riddle to work on. But David, in returning to this, I think it's important for people to keep in mind that they need to be able to fortify themselves with ideas. And what's being developed now through social media and through the infiltration of education by neo-Marxists and all of that. Oh yeah, it's Martin Heidegger. Yeah, that's who. Okay, it broke up when I said Heidegger. It's like a Heidegger hiccup. And so the infiltration of academia, which you can't argue because you can go on the internet and find people that are getting beat down by their professors because they don't ascribe to this whole agenda that's being put forward by the left. And it's that you have to be very selective about where you go to school if you don't want to get beat down for being conservative. I mean, that's kind of very strange. And what there was an article in the New York Times just the other day is maybe they need to have the UN to come in and straighten out the United States election. It's like as if like that was some kind of answer to something. It's like, oh my God, it's like the UN is basically the anteroom to China at this point, as is the World Health Organization. So this whole internationalism that's being fostered upon the world is not embraced by that many people, which is as a result of that, we have to look out for election fraud and all of that because they can't win in the world of ideas. They don't have an argument. They generally just speak against things. What they promote is a bunch of stuff that they have never delivered on as of yet. All you have to do is look to Venezuela, and that's your end game. But I wasn't going to get into the political dimension of this, and so we'll throw it back to you.
Right, yeah. Gosh, I'm really envious that you can see messages. I have Noah's laptop, so I can't see or do a thing apart from my your handsome American gentleman presence on screen and my rather bizarre and bewildering British presence. Yeah, I've read Being in Time by Heidegger. I actually enjoyed it very, very much. It strikes me, I mean, the whole book is about why he can't write about theology. Just write about theology. There we are. It's as simple as that. There we are. I had a friend of mine, a parliamentarian, who arrived at a similar conclusion, who said to me, "Why didn't he just get on with it? I'm not his agent. I'm sorry, I don't know." It's written in beautiful German. I'm told it's not a language. I'm not one of life's linguists. Unfortunately, and I like it. I like things written in aphorisms, and my British language edition seemed to fit the bill very nicely. But I must admit, I remember getting to the end and thinking, well, that was clever, but what was it all about? When I, so unlike Kierkegaard, who's one of my heroes, as everybody knows by now, excuse me, who probably arguably started the whole modern school, I hate that word, of existentialism, and is grossly misunderstood because, of course, he was a devout Christian. And as I said previously on this show, I think on his deathbed was praising God for the revelations that had happened in his life, for the type of understanding and knowledge that he received. So that's why people mustn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Arguably one of the greatest theologists, apparently theologian if you're a Catholic, theologist if you're not a Catholic. So I must be a theologian-theologist. Yes, I'm sort of stuck in the middle somewhere. I was deeply enriched by reading Kierkegaard in my spiritual life, and that was hard going when I started doing it. But it gave me the fortification to read people like Heidegger and be less afraid. What are people going to say? Let's just hear it. Let's just hear it and see if it can hold any water at all. And a lot of the time, and sometimes it's just what somebody else has said in a different way. And a lot of the time, it's actually very not as a person, as a seeker, as a thinking being, as a feeling being. And that's no disrespect to Heidegger. I mean, he was probably arguably the first person to talk about mass society, mass culture. And it's, gosh, I think I'm back again to start talking about the which of course is happening repeatedly. So I'm actually very grateful.
Yeah, David, you're breaking up, so I muted you. Let's see if we can give it a pause and then bring you back. In the meantime, I'll talk a little bit about these right here. Here's David's primary work, Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, by the celebrated author David William Parry, available on Amazon, and his Caliban's Redemption, which is a book of poetry. No, that's not a picture of him on the cover. And here's the Grammar of Witchcraft, which is not about witchcraft, it's a Shakespearean study. And those are all available on Amazon. And here's my first book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel, which is 640 pages. The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And it includes, beyond extensive bibliography, just a ton of cosmological diagrams that can help you decipher the aspects of initiation, culture, and the spiritual dimensions of esoteric Christianity. Now we'll come back and see if your mic is working. How you doing there, David? Your mic back?
I think I'm okay. Can you hear me, John? Gosh, I can't remember where I was up to, so we might as well move the conversation on. Apart from saying one thing, we're reopening my little church, Valentine's Hall, on the 1st of November. So I'd be very grateful for everybody's prayers. It'll be a very free church gathering because we're just grateful to be back. We're now sharing space with Balham Community Church, excuse me, which is a wonderful community church which is welcoming us, Metropolitan Community Church Group. So prayers, please, everybody. We'd be very, very grateful. And I'm actually probably holding a Rosicrucian Mass towards Christmas, because I think we have to delve into all of these traditions. I've never thought it was an either or. We need to be enriched as Christians by all of the various explorations and visions and insights of that great colossus of human tradition and divine inspiration known as Christendom. The only thing I disagree with Kierkegaard about, well, maybe there's one or two, is that Christianity as Christendom isn't all bad. It's done some absolutely extraordinary things, which we need to think about a lot more. And the richness of ritual, tradition, meditation, contemplation, ceremonial, theologists, the people that have contributed to the the health and well-being of the human race through Christendom is absolutely staggering. So I'll pass back to you. But as I say, all prayers welcome. And I know our tiny congregation watches the show. So big love to all of you, and look forward to seeing you soon. I'll pass the mic back to you, John.
Oh, well, I wish you the best of luck in your newest endeavor. I don't know if I don't recall if I mentioned, but my books can be found on eBay. Don't try and find them on Amazon. There's people hawking them on there sometimes for $1,000, and they're good books. And I'm not saying they wouldn't be worth it in the long run, in your next incarnation, when who knows what $1 will be worth then. But in any event, yeah, David, it'd be great. We're having such trouble with our signal here. It's unfortunate. I'm thinking back in the literary corridors that we're exploring, and when you get into with Nietzsche, for me, I think that the birth of tragedy is the one that really touched my spirit. It was very early on, and showing the thematic nature of tragedy within the coming out of the tradition of Greece. But in any event, as we explore these various themes in culture, theater, and religion, and so forth, I continually draw back, of course, to Rudolf Steiner, but also to the works of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the author of Faust. And he's somebody we've mentioned frequently here because he's amongst the group of three that were determined by a Harvard study on IQ to be the three highest IQs that they came across in historical figures, thousands of them that they examined, one of which is John Stuart Mill, and the other is Emanuel Swedenborg, and then the third figure is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And Rudolf Steiner was the editor of Goethe's scientific works. And so that gives us a context for most of the conversations we've had here. And but it's interesting in comparing the German romantics that arose out of the culture that surrounded Goethe and the Sturm und Drang period and all of that, and Sorrows of Young Werther. You know, the story of a guy dressed in blue and then ended up, because for romantic reasons, committing suicide. It was a short novella, actually. I have a copy of it here somewhere, but it's funny because Goethe really championed the cause of Napoleon when Napoleon was a Republican, and when he finally had the opportunity of meeting Napoleon, he he was disappointed again because what Napoleon said, "Oh yeah, you know, The Sorrows of Young Werther. That's one of my favorite books." You know, it's like, oh please, it's like something that he wrote when he was like, in his mind, a kid, and he'd so far gone so far beyond that. I mean, when you get into Faust and you get into the second part of Faust, it's interesting because Rudolf Steiner makes the point about the second half, uh, part two of Faust, is that you'll notice there were so few reviews of it because people really didn't know what to make with it because it represented the maturity of Goethe's thinking. And so you see that whole thematic thing about riddles that I'm talking about for education, providing riddles that one comes to work towards a solution later in life. And that's part two of Faust. And I'd recommend perhaps the translation of Baird Taylor. Uh, that's a good translation in English. But Novalis and Goethe and Schlegel and these characters were definitely would consider themselves Christian philosophers, right? Whereas your romantics in England consider themselves to be atheists because of their so thorough rejection of the moral dictates of the church at that time, and they were like libertines, which is like way beyond zebra in the stripe of libertarian. You know, again, William Godwin, the father of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, was the father of anarchy, right? So you have this rebellious spirit, but that's before 1879. And you see that that's the Luciferic Ahrimanic challenge of the establishment of the family and all of that. You see, that's right in this milieu of the war in heaven that's going on at that time, and the spirits. The war in heaven culminates in 1879, and those spirits are pushed down to earth, and then you get the conflicts of the 20th century under the inspiration of these spirits of materialism that tend towards conflict. And so it behooves one to try and be a lightning rod for the heavens through prayer and meditative thought and acts of kindness coming from the spirit of love. So, in the spirit of that, if we could get David, I hope that the signal doesn't get broken up, if he could share with us a prayer.
Just to address a couple of points before I get to prayer, and you've got to remember most of the British Romantics were actually Platonists, as I know you know. So it depends what you mean by atheist. I think atheists are running amok nowadays by claiming people that actually wouldn't have agreed with them at all. And it was because you've got a traditionalist Church of England that mirrors the social hierarchy, and that's what they wanted to get away from. So, you know, Shelley, he came up earlier. He, I think when he met his fatal accident was actually so. You know, so it again, as usually, depends what we mean by all of that.
Yes.
That is food for another conversation. I'm certain of it. Anyway, my dear friends, despite the hooks and crooks of modern technology, I'd like to bless everyone that's watching this show either regularly or as a new listener, a new viewer. I'd like to bless my friend John, who is a like soul. I mean, I've met not only a good friend, but a like soul, someone I enjoy talking with. And I know the Spirit of Truth in maybe a modest way, but a profound way, is working its sanctity through this show. So I'd like to pray in the turbulent weeks ahead, maybe during the times of an American election and the increasingly chaotic public affairs of Britain, that we all keep clear heads, cool minds, warm hearts, and that our eyes learn ever more clearly to focus on the single truth of the Christ energy which is above us all. Let's not be so judgmental. Let's pull the beam out of our own eyes, and remember we're all kith and kindred in a world created by love and wisdom. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much. We'll see you again next week. Our signal's so poor, I think we'll drop off a few minutes early. So everybody, I want to thank you for coming on board, and those of you that have ventured forward to get our books, good to you. And also the people that bought us cups of coffee. Thank you so much. Have a good week.